Before beginning the story, I'd like to say a big thank you for visiting my new channel. I'm going to be uploading alternate history-related stories every single day. If that sounds good, be sure to leave a like and don't forget to subscribe. It means a whole lot when just getting started. I hope you enjoy the story. The first one came on a Wednesday afternoon in late October while I was up a pole on Deering Street, replacing a corroded splice connector. I felt my phone buzz in my chest pocket and ignored it because I was 40 feet off the ground with both hands occupied. And when I came down an hour later and checked my messages, there was a voicemail from my own number, 22 seconds long. I figured it was a carrier glitch. My number calling itself was the kind of thing that happened occasionally in the network infrastructure, a routing error that sent a signal in a loop, and I dealt with routing errors professionally and knew they were usually minor and self-correcting. I played the message anyway because I was curious about what a routing error sounded like from the inside. It was my voice, not a recording of me, not a clip of something I'd said before. My voice saying new things in the specific way I said things, stumbling slightly over a word in the middle, the way I stumbled over words when I was talking without having thought out the full sentence first. The message said, "I don't know if this is working. I don't know if you're going to get this or if it's going somewhere else or nowhere at all. If you're hearing this, I need you to call me back. I know how that sounds. Just call me back." Then silence and the end tone. I stood next to my truck on Deering Street and listened to it twice more. Then I called my own number, which rang 4 times, and went to my own voicemail greeting, and I hung up without leaving a message because I didn't know what I would say. My name is Holt Crane, and I've worked cable and telephone infrastructure for going on 12 years, split between aerial line work and underground conduit, whatever the job requires. I work for a regional utility contractor and spend most of my days either up a pole or in a trench or crawling through the physical layer of the communication systems that most people interact with only as an abstraction, a signal on a screen, a voice through a speaker, without thinking much about the copper and fiber and connectors and splice cases that make any of it possible. I think about it constantly. That's the job. You develop a feel for the physical infrastructure, the way a plumber develops a feel for water pressure, a direct and specific understanding of how signals move through systems and what happens when they don't move the way they're supposed to. I can hear a problem in a line the way a musician hears a wrong note automatically without deciding to. The message on my phone had a particular audio quality that I recognized from my work, a very slight flutter in the voice signal, the kind of artifact you get when a transmission is passing through a compromised channel, bouncing through a section of the network that isn't handling it cleanly. It was subtle enough that most people wouldn't notice it. I noticed it immediately. I went back through my recent call logs and confirmed that the call had come from my own number. I checked the carrier's error logs for routing anomalies in my area and found nothing flagged, which meant whatever had produced the call wasn't showing up in the system's standard monitoring. I filed it and kept moving. The infrastructure had questions I didn't always have answers to immediately, and fieldwork didn't stop for unanswered questions. The second voicemail came 5 days later, from the same number, same voice, same flutter in the signal. This one was longer, about 3 minutes. The other me had apparently decided that the first message had gotten through and was moving forward on that assumption. He said he'd been trying to reach me for weeks, that this was the first time a message had actually landed. He said he understood how it must sound, hearing your own voice on your own voicemail, and that he wasn't going to spend much time on that part because there wasn't a version of that conversation that resolved quickly, and he had more important things to get to. He talked about where he was. He described his apartment, which was the same apartment I lived in, but with differences. A different couch, different paint on the kitchen walls, books on a shelf where I had a print, small things, the kind of differences that accumulate when two lives start from the same point and take slightly different angles over time. He mentioned his job, same field as mine, same general work, different company. He mentioned that he'd been doing the work alone for the past few years, which he said with a flatness that told me the alone part was the significant detail and the job was the context for it. He said he'd figured out the anomaly by accident. He was doing diagnostics on a section of aerial line near his neighborhood and found a signal irregularity that didn't match any fault he'd seen before, a transmission path that was routing through something that wasn't any node or relay in his network's infrastructure. He'd traced it because tracing irregularities was what he did, and the trace had eventually led him to the conclusion that the path crossed the boundary between his world and another one, and that the other one was close enough to his that the number he reached was his own. He said he'd tried calling dozens of times before this message got through. He said he was glad it had. I sat on my couch and listened to 3 minutes of my own voice describing a version of my life that had gone quieter and lonelier than mine. And I thought about the signal flutter in the recording, and I thought about the routing anomaly he'd described, and some part of my brain was already running both tracks simultaneously, the one that was trying to understand what I was hearing emotionally, and the one that was trying to understand it technically. The third voicemail came 2 days after that, and then the fourth 2 days after that, and the calls were coming more regularly as the anomaly apparently widened, or the path became more stable with use. Each message was longer than the last. He'd started talking about his life the way people talk, when they've found someone willing to listen after a long period of not being heard. He talked about the specific things that had diverged between us. Some of them he knew, and some of them he'd inferred from the differences in our circumstances. There was a decision he'd made about 6 years ago that he'd made one way, and I'd apparently made another, though he didn't know what my version of the decision had been. His version had led to a series of subsequent events that had reduced the number of people in his life gradually over time. The slow, natural attrition of contact and closeness when you make certain choices about where you live and how you work and what you prioritize. He wasn't blaming himself specifically. He said it more like a person describing a weather pattern. This led to, that led to the other thing. This is where I ended up. He said he wasn't miserable. He said he wanted me to know that. He was just alone in a way that had become the background condition of his life, the way a constant low sound becomes the baseline against which you measure the silence. He said hearing my number ring and connect and leave a message had been the best thing that had happened to him in a year, which was a small thing to say, and a large thing to mean. I listened to the fourth message twice, and then I went out and drove to a section of aerial line on the northeast side of town that had been showing minor anomalies in the system monitoring for the past week, and I spent 2 hours on the pole doing diagnostics, not because it was urgent, but because I needed to be doing something with my hands while I thought. I found the anomaly on my third day of looking. I want to be precise about what I mean when I say anomaly, because in my work the word has a specific technical meaning that's different from its general usage. In the network infrastructure, an anomaly is any signal behavior that falls outside the parameters of the system's design, anything the network isn't accounting for and isn't routing through its standard pathways. Most anomalies are small and local and have mundane causes. A connector corroded enough to introduce resistance, a splice that wasn't done cleanly, a section of cable with physical damage that's affecting signal integrity. What I found on the northeast side was not any of those things. It was a section of the network where the signal was routing through a path that didn't correspond to any physical infrastructure I could account for. Not a bypass, not a loop, not a routing table error. The signal was going somewhere the network had no record of and coming back carrying artifacts that hadn't been in it when it left. And those artifacts were small but measurable. And they were coming from somewhere in the transmission path that I couldn't locate on any map. And the section of network where this was happening was degrading. Slowly, incrementally, but measurably. The splice cases in that section were showing accelerated corrosion that didn't match the environmental conditions. The cable jackets had hairline cracks that weren't consistent with the age of the cable. The physical infrastructure was wearing out faster than it should have been, and the anomalous path was at the center of the degradation radius. I sat in my truck for a while after I'd confirmed this. Then I went back up the pole and did 3 more hours of diagnostics, running every test I had, and when I came down, I had a picture that was as complete as I was going to get from my side. The calls were using something physical. The path crossed through the boundary between the two timelines via the actual copper and fiber infrastructure, the physical layer of the network, and the passage was wearing the components the way a high current load wears the conductors it passes through. Each call made the path more established and made the degradation worse. He didn't know. I was certain he didn't know, because if he'd seen what I was seeing on his side of the infrastructure, he'd have mentioned it in the messages. He thought he'd found a harmless channel. He'd found something that was quietly taking apart the network around it every time he used it. Getting a message back took me 4 days. I'm not going to try to explain the technical steps in a way that would satisfy anyone with specific knowledge of how phone networks work, partly because some of what I did was improvised in a way that I wouldn't want to defend professionally, and partly because the detailed explanation isn't the point. The point is that I used what I knew about the anomaly's physical location and behavior to introduce a signal of my own into the path at a moment when the path was active, which was an approach that required more precision than most of my usual fieldwork, and which I got wrong twice before I got it right. The message I sent was short because short was what the channel could handle. I said, "The path is damaging the infrastructure on my side and probably yours too. Each call makes it worse. I understand what you've been doing, and I understand why, and I'm sorry that I have to tell you to stop, but I need you to stop. I didn't know if it got through. I went home and waited. He called once more, 2 days later. The message was about a minute long. His voice had the specific quality of a person who has received news they were partly expecting and has decided to be practical about it. He said he'd gone back and looked at his own infrastructure the day after he got my message, knowing what to look for, and had found the same thing I'd found. He said he was sorry, that he hadn't understood what the calls were doing, and that if he had, he wouldn't have made them, which I believed completely because it was what I would have said in the same position. He said he was going to close his end of the path. He said he knew how to do it, that the physical fix was straightforward once you knew what you were addressing, and that once it was closed, it probably wouldn't be something either of us could reopen. He said that was fine. He said he'd heard enough of my life in the background of a few minutes of connection to know I was okay, and that knowing that was worth more than the conversations themselves. He said, take care of yourself. He said it the way I said it, the specific inflection I used at the end of a sentence when I meant it, rather than when it was just words. Then the message ended. The anomaly cleared within 48 hours. The network monitoring stopped flagging the northeast section. The physical components in the affected area held where they were. The degradation stopped. The advanced corrosion I documented not worsening, just sitting there as the record of what had happened. I submitted a maintenance report for the affected section, citing standard environmental wear as the cause. The work order went in. The repair crew went out. The components were replaced. The network came back to full spec. Everything went back to normal in the way that everything always goes back to normal in infrastructure work. The system absorbing the anomaly and continuing as if it had never been there. I kept the voicemails. I've listened to them a few times in the weeks since. Not obsessively, just occasionally. At the end of a long day when the apartment is quiet and I have an hour before I'm tired enough to sleep, I listen to my own voice talking about a life that went differently than mine, the specific texture of it, the way certain choices compound over time into a landscape you're living in before you've fully decided to live there. He was right that we were the same person. I could hear that in every message, the identical verbal habits, the way the sentences were built, the particular things we reached for when we were trying to be honest about something. Same person, different landscape. I think about the decision he mentioned, the one he'd made 6 years ago one way, and I'd apparently made another. I don't know what my version of it was. It didn't register to me as a significant moment at the time, because significant moments rarely do. They only look that way from far enough away. But whatever I chose, it pointed me somewhere different from where he ended up. And I've thought about that more than is probably useful and come to the conclusion that there isn't anything useful to do with it except notice it. 4 weeks after the last voicemail, my phone rang from my own number. Not a voicemail, the call itself ringing. I was eating dinner and I looked at the screen and watched my own number ring 3 times and then stop. No message left. I sat at the table for a while after that. The apartment was the ordinary quiet of a weekday evening, and I thought about a man in a quieter version of the same apartment, holding a phone that had just connected to something he'd closed and wondering, The way you wonder about a decision once it's made and can't be unmade, whether it was the right thing. I think it was. I think we both know it was. The infrastructure matters. The physical layer that holds everything up. The actual copper and fiber and connectors doing the work underneath the abstraction. It can only carry what it was built to carry. And the rest comes at a cost that eventually presents itself, whether you've been tracking it or not. I know that better than most people. It's the job. I finished my dinner and washed up and went to bed. And in the morning, I drove out to the northeast section to check on the repaired components, out of habit and because the physical layer always deserved a follow-up look after a repair, and everything held, solid and functioning, the network carrying what it was supposed to carry and nothing more. That was enough.